Hello and welcome to everyone. I'm Dr. Robert Yielding, and I'm representing the National Social Anxiety Center, or NSAC. One of our goals at NSAC is to provide other mental health professionals with the best available knowledge and expertise to treat social anxiety disorder. And to that end, we're very fortunate to be joined today by Dr. Christine Padesky. Dr. Padesky is co-founder of the Center for Cognitive Therapy in Huntington Beach, California, a distinguished founding fellow of the Academy of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, an honorary fellow of the British Association of Behavioral and Cognitive Psychotherapies, and a leading CBT innovator. She's taught more than 500 CBT workshops on 5 continents for 50,000 therapists, winning international awards for her enduring contributions to the field. She's co-author of 7 books, including the award-winning Mind Over Mood, 2nd edition, written with Dennis Greenberger, and the new Clinicians Guide to CBT using Mind Over Mood, 2nd edition, which was published in April 2020. This latest book details her vision of collaborative, client-centered CBT. Welcome, Dr. Padesky, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes. So to start, I noticed that the title of your new 2nd edition is The Clinicians Guide to CBT using Mind Over Mood. This seems like a subtle but important change. Can you tell me about that a little bit first?
I certainly can. It was interesting because I started out writing, and I say Dennis Greenberger wrote the group chapter at the end of the book, but the other 13 chapters are ones that I ended up writing. So when I started writing the bulk of the book, which is about how to use Mind Over Mood in therapy, it started out as a step-by-step use of Mind Over Mood with lots of details about the evidence and empirical basis for the different worksheets and how and when to use it in therapy, and lots of case illustrations. But I realized I couldn't really write about it out of context. And I've been, as you said, teaching CBT for many decades now. And so I wanted to put Mind Over Mood in the framework of all of CBT, and also talk about ideas about how I think CBT is best practiced. And so there's lots of information in the book, not directly related to Mind Over Mood, about how to structure therapy sessions and how to do collaborative case conceptualization, how to use Socratic dialogue. And I'm really more proud of this book than any book I've ever written. Because I've had an opportunity to write the book I wished I had had when I was learning to be a CBT therapist. But at the same time, I tried to include sophisticated clinical examples that, for therapists who are more experienced and advanced, they would read the book and say, oh, I never thought about it that way, or that's an interesting way of dealing with that dilemma. And so I'm very pleased that the early feedback I've been getting from people is that they're finding that every chapter they're learning new ideas, even people who've practiced for 20, 30 years. So it really is a book. I convinced Guilford to add the words, how the Clinician's Guide to CBT using Mind Over Mood, to illustrate that the book is a pretty broad-based CBT book, as well as a detailed guide to using Mind Over Mood in therapy.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be useful for experienced clinicians, but also people who are maybe teaching CBT to beginners.
Yes, and that was my thought. I actually had those teachers in mind. Since I'm a teacher myself, I've been teaching workshops for so many years. I wanted to partner with people at university and postgraduate programs who were doing teaching, and offer them my ideas about what I've seen therapists over the years have the best response to in terms of their learning.
Right. There's also an anxiety disorders chapter, in particular in the Clinician's Guide. Can you tell us how that chapter will inform clinicians who treat social anxiety disorder in particular?
Sure. There's actually, there's 2 anxiety chapters in the book, and what I divided it out by is the first anxiety chapter talks about anxiety treatment principles across anxiety disorders. And the second chapter goes through various anxiety diagnoses, including social anxiety, and teaches what's the most evidence-based protocols for treating that disorder, and step-by-step, how do you do it. And the reason I wanted to have both chapters is that I think it's really important that therapists know principles like approach, don't avoid, be aware and elicit imagery and work with imagery and how to work with imagery with anxiety, things like that. Because even if we know the protocols very well, we often run into stuck points in them. And so by knowing anxiety treatment principles, when we hit a roadblock in therapy, we can make sure we're resolving that roadblock in a way that follows good anxiety treatment principles and isn't just us colluding with safety behaviors or avoidance on the part of our clients. In terms of social anxiety in particular, in that second chapter, when I'm going through treatment protocols, I actually do two things. I summarize the work of the leading social anxiety treatment protocols, but I highlight work that many therapists, particularly in North America, are not as familiar with, which is work being done at Oxford University by David Clark and his lab. And they've developed, I think, some of the most innovative treatment methods for working with social anxiety. Things like if people are concerned about blushing or stumbling over words or things like that, they have a protocol where they actually videotape people in different situations, and then they elicit in therapy, what are your images, what do you think you appeared like when we recorded you, and if you thought you were blushing, here's a color chart, how pink was your face, pick the color. And then they actually watch the video together in session and compare the reality to the image that the person had in their head. And this kind of corrective feedback is really useful with social anxiety. With David's permission, we actually, on my YouTube channel, Christine Padesky, we posted a video demonstrating that approach to working with social anxiety. So I covered that, which is the current best evidence base, and then I also covered and described the approach I developed 20-some years ago, 25 years ago, of working with social anxiety, which I call assertive defense of the self. And I explained the kind of origins and rationale and evidence base for my own approach, and give a detailed case example with lots of dialogues at each step along the way so that therapists can get a better feel for how to use assertive defense of the self with social anxiety.
It sounds like it really covers the evidence base, but also teaches you how to look outside the box a little bit and troubleshoot, how to use it in a more nuanced way.
I hope so, and I do all of that in 15 to 20 pages, so it's a good kind of succinct read for people who don't have a lot of time.
You mentioned an intervention you developed called Assertive Defense of the Self, which I've found to be immensely impactful for clients both individually and within groups. What led you to originally develop Assertive Defense of the Self?
Well, it's an interesting story, Robert. I actually developed it because back in the late 80s, early 1990s, I was working with a lot of clients with social anxiety, and I was also working with lots of clients who had specific other types of phobias, specific phobias like fear of flying and all of that. And I noticed that all my phobia clients were getting better really fast, like 2, 3, 4, maximum 6 sessions, and we'd be treating their phobia, but my social anxiety clients weren't getting better. And I was really kind of frustrated as a clinician by this, and I was also puzzled because I thought, it's another phobia, why isn't it working? And I was at the time following what was being published in the literature, the CBT literature, as evidence-based practice, which was largely trying to use cognitive restructuring to convince people that people wouldn't be critical and rejecting. And one day, as I was sitting down thinking about a particular case, I realized, wait a minute, the central principle of phobia treatment is you should expose people to what they're afraid of and help them cope with that, or help them develop confidence that they can cope with that. And yet with social anxiety, it's a phobia that we're treating by trying to convince them that the danger doesn't exist. That really doesn't fit with anxiety treatment principles. So I thought, well, what are people with social anxiety afraid of? And I'll just put up a slide here to show you. So with social anxiety, the thing that people are afraid of is typically criticism, rejection. They feel shamed of certain things. And this is what is central. And one of the anxiety treatment principles that I highlight in the Clinicians Guide is we want to make sure that good interventions that we're doing in therapy are really targeting the most central beliefs that are maintaining the anxiety disorder. So with social anxiety, it's the fear of criticism and rejection largely, often accompanied by feelings of shame, that are the central features of social anxiety. So I developed this assertive defense of the self as a way to expose people to criticism and rejection with an emphasis on coping. So I was really taking the phobia treatment model and adapting it to the details and emphasis of social anxiety. And we can't really count on people encountering a lot of direct criticism and rejection on a daily basis, which is ideal in exposure. You want to make sure people regularly are getting exposed to what they're afraid of. So what I did in my protocol that I developed is I asked clients to predict what are other people's reactions going to be. And oftentimes these are not things that people would directly say to us, but what are other people thinking about you? What are the worst criticisms and thoughts that people could be having about you that make you most anxious? So I got clients to make a list of these. And then the second thing we would do in therapy is I would then help them develop assertive responses that they could say in response to these criticisms. And we made like a movie script, you know, being in the shadow of Hollywood here in Southern California, everyone is well aware of script writing. So I'd say on the left-hand side of the page, we're going to have the criticisms. That's like the critical character. That's what they would say. And on the right-hand side of the page, we're going to make assertive responses. So for example, if someone was afraid of someone thinking, you know, you're stumbling over your words, you must be really stupid, we would make an assertive response. And the idea is the assertive response would capture any truth in what the person was saying, but it would also assertively stand up for the kind of integrity of the person who is being criticized, of the client. So they might come up with a statement like, well, it's true, I am stumbling over words because I'm a bit anxious right now, and yet that doesn't make me stupid. Or if it was someone, say, who was intellectually challenged and was, quote, stupid by social standards, they might say, well, I might be stupid compared to a lot of people, but I am actually quite smart about a lot of things, and I get on quite well in my life. So we try to get people to come up with a very individualized, personalized, assertive response that has credibility to them and suits their circumstances. What we do then, once we have all the criticisms written out and an assertive response for each, is I then would do in-session practice with them. So we were doing exposure in the session to criticism. I would read the critical responses off their list, and they would read back initially their assertive responses to me. And we would start in a very mild way. I would read them in a not very critical tone. I might start by just reading in a kind of a wooden, poor acting voice. You've been stumbling over your words. You must be stupid. So kind of flat. And they would read back their response. Now, based on how they read it back, I would then help them debrief and coach their experience. I'd say, what did it feel like saying that? Typically in the beginning, people with social anxiety say, well, I read the words, but it didn't really seem true to me. I'd say, well, that's okay. And then I would coach them and say, you know, I noticed that you didn't really look me in the eye when you said it. You were kind of slumped over in your shoulders. Let's get your shoulders back and your feet on the floor and try saying that same statement, but look me in the eye and just act like you believe it, even though you're telling me you don't. Act like you believe it. And so then they would read their statement back again. And we would then, once they could do it and read it back in a fairly assertive, solid way, I would debrief again and say, how did it feel that time? And they'd say, gee, that felt better. I felt more like I was really standing up for myself. What we would do then is I would increase the difficulty. I might start saying the criticism in more strong ways. So I might say, gee, you stumbled over your words. What are you, stupid or something? So I would both non-verbally and verbally start increasing the level of criticism, always just a little bit above what I'd done before so that they can have some success. If they kind of fell apart and weren't able to assertively respond, or their shoulders slump, or I could tell they got really hurt by the criticism, stop immediately, debrief, bolster up their coping, have them practice what they could say in response to that. Other ways to increase difficulty are to start to string multiple criticisms together. And eventually, after several sessions of practice, I'd start throwing in novel criticisms and see if they could assertively defend themselves on the fly. Now, this was a real direct helping people develop competence and confidence in their ability to cope with criticism. And I actually presented this to them as a rationale before we begin this intervention. And I have found every social anxiety client gets it. They're like, I said, there's two ways to go. We could go the route of trying to convince you that people aren't going to criticize you, or we could go the route of you developing your confidence that you can handle criticism so it doesn't bother you so much. Which path do you think would be better for you? And clients mostly choose the dealing with, coping with criticism path. Now, what I want them to do then, once they often we don't start the outside homework practice until they've had at least 2 sessions of assertive defense practice in session. We might do 15 to 20 assertive defense interchanges in a single session. I then want them to go outside of session and practice assertive defense. But this practice is often in their head because, as I said, most people aren't directly critical. So we have people go and talk to people, make mistakes, stutter, they might practice first in situations with strangers and then with people that they know. And we don't ask them to do assertive response just if people criticize them, because we think this is unlikely. But instead, I have them go into social interactions and imagine that people are criticizing them, and then do a covert in their mind assertive defense response, and try to maintain eye contact, try to maintain a relaxed posture, and try to feel assertive as they mentally respond to what's going on. They come back after having had these experiences, and we debrief the experiences they had and plan future experiments depending upon residual beliefs, safety behaviors, things like this. When we debrief these experiences, we want to keep the focus on coping, because the goal is not to prove to people that people aren't critical. The goal is actually to assume that people are critical and to ask themselves, what did you do to cope with that criticism? Is there anything you could have done or said that would have been a better way of coping, would have helped you felt better in the situation? What do you think would have happened if you had done this? Can you think of some ways you can remember to do that next time? So we want to keep the focus on coping and the focus on dealing with criticism. And so I guess one thing that's quite different about my approach than other approaches to social anxiety is I don't generally spend much time at all talking about, is it likely that others are critical or not? But instead, I take the approach of, let's assume people are critical, and how can you cope with that? And I find once I started using assertive defense of the self, I was pleased that my clients with social anxiety started to get better much more quickly, much more similar to my other phobia clients. And so that convinced me I was on a good track.
Dr. Padesky, how, if at all, have your ideas evolved in the treatment of social anxiety disorder since assertive defense of the self was first developed?
Well, for a number of years after I developed this model, I was pretty solid, okay, this is the way to go. And I would pretty much do this all on its own with all my socially anxious clients. One of the things that's led to greater flexibility and evolution on my part has been the improvements in social anxiety treatments, a lot of them coming out of England and David Clark's group, where they have gotten so creative about doing behavioral experiments and going out in communities with people so that if someone's worried that they sweat too much and people are going to think negatively of them, they'll spray their shirts with water and go into a shop and have the client stand back and watch how people react. And the client may say, yeah, well, they won't criticize you when you're in the shop, but as soon as you leave, they're going to make fun of you and ridicule you. And so then the therapist might actually leave the shop and have the client stay there and observe behavior after they leave to test out some of these beliefs about the likelihood and ways in which people can criticize. So I've been impressed by that work, and they get very good treatment outcomes and have good treatment effectiveness. So I think I've become convinced that's a really important and good approach also. I think for my own part, what this has led me to think is if people are really focused on their appearance, aspects, kind of distorted views of how they look and appear and come across, I think then doing this kind of video testing out of those negative beliefs can be very, very helpful. But if people are mostly concerned about feeling very devastated if they feel like people are criticizing or rejecting them, then I think assertive defense of the self may be a more direct treatment method. So the way I'm thinking about it now is that there are two strong lines of treatment for social anxiety. I'm unfortunately not a researcher and not at a university and not in a position to do a lot of research on this, so we don't have the evidence on the assertive defense of the self, the same kind of randomized controlled treatment trials of it. We just have lots of clinical case studies. So I'm kind of the mind right now that we could kind of think about which approach is going to be most helpful for a given client. And what's really nice is if you're working with that client for 3, 4, or 5 weeks and their social anxiety doesn't seem to be budging, you can always shift to the other approach, because it may be that one approach will work better for one person and another approach for another. So I think I'm mostly heartened because I think today we can really count on a much higher treatment success rate with social anxiety, and having good knowledge of solid treatment approaches moves us much further along as clinicians than we were 25 years ago when I started.
Yes, yes. And along those lines, what are your thoughts on the importance of using imagery in the treatment of anxiety disorders and social anxiety disorder in particular? Okay,
I'm glad you asked that, because I think imagery is so important, and it's something that a lot of therapists don't use or pay attention to enough. If you ask someone who's socially anxious, what are you socially anxious about? They'll give you just a word answer. They'll say, oh, I think I look stupid, or people, think I'm lame, they judge me. But if you then ask them to pay attention to what images come in their mind when they imagine a situation, when they say they look stupid, what are they seeing in their mind's eye? How are they appearing and coming across to others? The images really explain the level of anxiety so much better, and it makes it more testable too in terms of doing behavioral experiments, getting video feedback, this sort of thing. So people often imagine people being critical of them with really harsh tones and really exaggerated negative language, and you can you can then test and say, does that sound like that person? Do you hear that person, that friend, talking about other people in that same harsh tone? Sometimes they do, but often they don't. So I think identifying and testing images often makes it much easier to do the work, because first of all, you get a clearer understanding of what's making the person so anxious. And also, once the person with social anxiety says their image aloud, they often begin to do some kind of modulating, and they say, well, really, that's pretty extreme. It's probably not like that. So identify imagery is always present with social anxiety. So I think identifying the image often gives us good treatment avenues that we can explore.
Yeah. I'm just curious, have you often found that clients are able to connect their socially anxious image they have to actual past circumstances, events, traumas, so to speak, that they're able to then work with?
Yes, sometimes, Robert, because as you're kind of alluding to, a good portion, more than half of people with social anxiety have had earlier experiences in their life of being bullied. I think this is why the idea of just testing out, are people likely to criticize you, is kind of a dead-end road for social anxiety treatment, because a lot of people with social anxiety have been bullied, treated very harshly, abused by either peers or friends. And so sometimes their image reflects this. They may be much smaller in size than they are now as adults, or they may hear the voice of someone in the past who taunted them. And so that can also be very helpful to them in terms of differentiating, as we do in PTSD treatment, differentiating between then and now, and making corrections in that. The other thing that has really become significant over the last 2 decades is the internet. And people, therapists are not standing on firm ground if we say, oh, well, people aren't very critical. You only have to be on the internet for about 5 minutes to see that there are a lot of people in the world who are really very, very critical. And with the internet and with the anonymity of social media, many of the clients that we work with, in addition to their real world experiences, may have virtual world experiences where they've also been bullied, made fun of, talked down to. And so I think this is another way that assertive defense of the self can be really helpful to people, because we can literally also practice assertive defense of the self with online bullying statements.
Yes.
Yeah.
So utilizing assertive defense of the self over the years, my colleagues and I have noticed some common challenges that clients share in putting it into practice. For example, some clients might report that they would never, quote unquote, actually say these assertions in real life, even after practicing them in role plays and imagery several times. They might say it's just not their personality or not their values to be so confrontational, and therefore maybe the strategy isn't useful for them. How might you respond to a client who says this?
Okay, well, there's a couple levels to this. The first is, I pick up on the word confrontational. Usually assertive defense of the self is not confrontational. I try to teach people there's a kind of a continuum between aggressive on one end, being very passive on the other end, and assertions lives in the middle. And so when someone says to us, you're stupid, we could be aggressive and say, you're the most ignorant person on the planet, and attack them. And that would be aggression. That's not what we're headed for. Or we could just say, yeah, I'm stupid, and hang our head, and that's on the passive end. We're going for something in the middle, which might be saying, I don't know why you think I'm stupid. I'm not. Or it might, if we've just done something fairly stupid, you might say, I agree what I just did was stupid, but that doesn't make me a stupid person. Or if it's someone criticizing us out of an area of expertise, we could always say to them, okay, you clearly know more about this than I do, but there's other areas I'm knowledgeable about. So it's not putting the other person down. So first of all, confrontational, I'd want to find out, is the client thinking they're going to be confronting or putting the other person down? If it's just being assertive and standing up for ourselves, the good news is you don't actually have to ever say it aloud to anyone to have the benefits of this approach. So we want to be measuring their social anxiety and measuring their ability and willingness to go into social situations and interact fully. And if they're getting better and they've never said an assertive comment to someone else, no worries. The important thing is that they think this in their head, that they're practicing assertive defense in their own mind. If that is allowing them to do everything they want, great. But if someone said to me, even if someone spoke out, I often refer to it to people as we can get lucky and sometimes run into a critical person. And I'll often have people make a plan to get lucky. For instance, you might have some friends who are always criticizing, in modern parlance, throwing shade on people. And so you could practice assertive defense with them in one way or another. Or you might have a family member who's always critical of you. So you could, once you get really good and confident in your skills, practice assertive defense with them. If someone said, I would never under any circumstances verbally say assertive defense out loud, then I would get suspicious and get curious about, is this some sort of avoidance or safety behavior that's kicking up? And I try to find out the underlying assumptions supporting that statement. So for example, I would say, I'm thinking you've got some kind of thought about what would happen if you did. Like, if I assertively defended myself, then what are you afraid might happen? And then I could get some of their beliefs, and we could then maybe test that. One point related to that I also want to say is there are many circumstances where we should actually dissuade our clients from using assertive defense aloud. I talk about in the Clinicians Guidebook the real importance when we're sending clients out to do behavioral experiments of keeping in mind safety. There are many circumstances like of domestic violence, abusive people, some interactions like with law enforcement or authority figures, or a boss online, a boss in your workplace who's very thin-skinned, where being assertive might actually lead to very negative consequences for you. So we don't want to send clients out with giving them the idea that anytime anyone criticizes you, you need to assertively defend yourself. None of us would do that in our life. We're all trying to use wisdom about when to do these approaches. But the good news is people don't really need to assertively defend themselves out loud except in therapy. Although many clients, once they really believe the assertive defense, they do choose to speak up in certain situations when it's safe to do so.
That might just start to come out more naturally. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
That also might connect to this next question, in which I've also had some clients tell me that they're much more anxious that someone would think the critical thoughts about them than they would actually say them out loud. Mm-hmm. These clients might say, if someone were rude enough to actually say such a thing, the client would think less of that person and not care, disregard it. Yeah. But if they respected the person, or if the person was polite enough not to say it out loud, this might still be very upsetting to clients because they wouldn't know how the other person truly feels or how to really use the assertion strategy effectively in that scenario. How would you work with that or reply to those clients?
Well, first of all, I would agree with them that some people in their life probably are critical of them and don't speak it out loud. So I always start from that assumption. I'm not trying to dissuade people that some people criticize us. And so I would have them go into situations with those people and imagine they were being critical, and again, practice the assertive defense and see how much they can believe their assertive defense. Initially when people start practicing assertive defense, they only believe the assertive defense statements 1 or 2%. With practice in therapy, it will get up to 20, 30, 40%, and then 50% and 60%. So at the point where they're believing it 60, 70, 80%, and then they're in a good place to go into those situations and imagine people they care about and respect, thinking critically about them. Then the other thing they can do if they want to overcome that is they can elicit honest feedback, because these are probably people that they work with or relationships with, that they value their relationships with these people. And so you can also practice role plays where they go to someone and say, you know, I'd really like your honest feedback on something, you know, and sometimes in the meetings I do such and so, and I've often wondered if you feel critical about that or what your thoughts are about that. And assertive defense doesn't mean batting down criticism. It means reaching a point of self-confidence where you can hear criticism and make good use of it, either to accept it and make a change, or you can reflect it back and say, I don't agree with you, or you can be humorous in response to it, or whatever is appropriate, that you have some kind of flexible way of dealing with it. But we're not afraid of it anymore. So you could actually, with those people, go and request feedback, and sometimes the person may be accurately perceiving it. This is where I think it's helpful to practice in therapy in advance. So I might, if a client was coming to me and I was being the person, I might have them be the person in a role play and give me the negative feedback. They're afraid the person. And then I would respond to it in an assertive way and say, well, I appreciate your honesty. It can be hard to give people negative feedback. That's not been my intent to come across that way. I'm going to think about what you told me. And if I want more feedback, could I come back and talk to you about this again? And so I might model ways of accepting criticism, or maybe if you disagree with it, at least receiving it and saying, I'll think about it. And after people do these kind of role plays, you know, this is another level of getting comfortable with criticism. The idea is not that criticism isn't there, or that criticism is always there, or that it's always right or always wrong. It's a matter of helping people feel calm and able to cope with criticism so that they can then show the flexibility to benefit and grow from legitimate criticism, not be sidestepped by illegitimate criticism, if you would, and that they don't have to avoid situations where criticism might be present.
Dr. Padesky, thanks so much for joining me again today and offering your insights and expertise. What resources are available to viewers who want to learn some more about your work?
Well, thank you for having me today, Robert, and for inviting me to talk about this work. It's been a lot of fun to speak with you about these ideas. If people want to hear more, I'll put a slide up that will show people some options that they have. We actually have recently started putting clinical tips, posting clinical tips the first and third Tuesday of every month. And you can get those at the YouTube channel, Christine Padesky. And that's also where you can find an example of the use of video and work with social anxiety from a recording and a video that was made by David Clark's group at Oxford. So that's there, and we're going to be posting this interview and some other things on our YouTube channel. If you want to, people who are interested in following me can follow me on Twitter. And there's also my website, which is Padesky.com, where we have lots of clinical tools and information that therapists can download, as well as many of my publications. And that's where you can find my original 1997 article on assertive defense of the self. The Clinician's Guide to CBT Using Mind Over Mood is certainly has many of my best clinical ideas in it and lots of clinical tips. In terms of specific references for the assertive defense of self, the 1997 paper is at the bottom of this slide, and this gives the exact address where people can find that paper and print it out for themselves. And then we made a video of an entire session showing me using assertive defense of the self with a woman who's socially anxious. And that can be found, that's one of the videos we've made that we do have for sale on DVD, and it's available at store.padesky.com. So those are the best places to follow my own work, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to tell people about that. And I hope you keep in touch and people keep in touch. And I want to just give appreciation to your organization for all the good work you do disseminating information about social anxiety treatment. As you know, it's such a big issue and it's so common in society. And the good news is that most people can overcome social anxiety in a fairly short time frame, matter of months, not years. So thank you for the good work you do disseminating all the good ideas that will help therapists be more effective in helping people overcome it.
Well, thank you. This will be a great addition to what we're trying to do. So appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Good talking to you today. Bye-bye.